Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Salatu wassalam ala Rasul al-Kareem. Now, Isa alayhi salam is one of the most mysterious figures in all of history. Some have denounced him completely as a false messiah. They said he was an impostor. He claimed to be a messenger from God, but he was not. They said that he was born by illegitimate means, so they launched an accusation against his mother. These are things that the Quran come to defend Jesus alayhi salam about. In Surah 4, Surah Nisa, the Quran defends Isa alayhi salam by speaking about the Buhtan Azima, the great calumny which people launched against his mother. And as for the claim that they killed him and crucified him, the Quran says, "Ma qataluhu wa ma salabuhu walakin shubbiha lahum." They killed him not, nor did they crucify him, but it was made so to appear to them. They thought that they were proving Isa alayhi salam to be a false messiah, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala was vindicating him in the Quran and showing him to be true. On the other hand, there were some others who tried to follow Isa alayhi salam. They loved him, they revered him, they respected his teachings, but they exaggerated about his personality. They elevated him to the position of divinity. They made him a god. And whereas he himself bowed down and worshipped the one true God, the God of Abraham, of Moses, and his own God, others took him for the God that he spoke about. And they said that somehow God is not only the Father, but also the Son, Jesus, and also the Holy Spirit. Together, the three somehow make one. Now, in order to protect this later evolving faith in Isa alayhi salam, Gospels and other writings were collected, writings which were more conducive towards this faith. Details about Isa alayhi salam were disputed for many centuries, until eventually the books that make up the New Testament portion of the Bible were collected together. Now, very early after Isa alayhi salam, some Gospels came to be written, but were not collected in the Bible. We have remnants of two such Gospels now. One is called the Gospel of Thomas, that was written about approximately 20 years after Isa alayhi salam. Another one is called by the German word Quelle, which means source, because we don't know the name of this Gospel, so we just refer to it by the name source, because German scholars came to first believe that a certain Gospel was used as a source by some later Gospels which are now written in the New Testament, in the Christian Bible. So that hypothetical Gospel, which the Germans called Quelle, or source, is now referred to in short by just simply the letter Q. So we refer to that as the Q Gospel, written around 20 years after Isa alayhi salam had left the scene. But these Gospels, as I've said, did not survive as part of the Christian Bible. Other writings later on would be written and would be collected. Now, the earliest writings that are collected in the Christian Bible are letters written by a certain man by the name Paul. His original name was Saul, and according to the Bible itself, initially he was a persecutor of early Christians. He went from town to town trying to gather them to arrest them and bring them back for trial under the Jewish authorities of the day. In other words, Christianity at the time was not a very favorable religion to practice. It was a dangerous time to be a Christian. And Paul was one of those who was persecuting the early Christians. But according to his own writings, he had a turnaround. Somehow Jesus appeared to him and made him a disciple. And so he, with this new revelation from Jesus, became an ardent follower of Jesus now and a preacher of the Christian message. But before him, there were already disciples of Jesus. There were already followers of Jesus who were preaching their understanding of what Jesus left behind by way of teaching. Now, there were some differences between Paul's teaching on the one hand and the teaching of these other disciples on the other hand. We know this from two sources. One is from Paul's own writings. We see in his writings that he is disputing with other people. He is teaching one thing and some others are teaching another thing. Paul, apparently from his own writings, would go into a certain town. He would teach people his understanding of the gospel, and subsequent to him, some other teachers would come in and teach these people the very opposite, turning them away from the teachings of Paul. And then Paul would write them another letter blasting them for why they have turned away from the gospel that he had given them to another gospel. Now, historians have tried to find out who might be these other persons that Paul is disputing with. And from the manner in which he has written about these other individuals, it would seem that these other individuals were very important early followers of Jesus. Paul refers to them sometimes as super apostles, which means like the Rusulul Uzama, the great apostles, which means the apostles of Isa alayhi salam, his Rusul, his messengers that he sent to various parts. And that would include people like Peter and James and John, some early and very important disciples of Jesus. What this means then is that from the letters of Paul, we can gather that Paul was teaching one thing and the disciples of Jesus were teaching another thing. And it so turns out that it would be the followers of Paul who eventually compile the books that would make up the New Testament portion of the Christian gospel, or of the Christian Bible. That would be that portion of the Christian Bible that deals specifically with Isa alayhi salam, as opposed to that which came before Isa alayhi salam, meaning what is now called the Old Testament. Now, I know some of this may sound complex, but if you have questions about this, I'd be glad to answer these questions after I introduce a few thoughts to you. So here we have one source showing us that Paul was teaching something else different from the teaching of the original disciples of Jesus. Another such source is also in the Christian Bible. It's in a book called the Acts of the Apostles. You might say these are the Hayat al-Sahaba of the Christians. It's the lives and the teachings of the disciples of Jesus after Jesus had left. Now, the first part of that book deals with the original disciples of Jesus. And then the second part of the book switches to Paul. So we can see a certain orientation here. The writer wants to show a continuity between what the original disciples taught and what Paul is now teaching. Paul cannot just come simply out of thin air. He has to rest on the foundations of what went before. And so the writer has carefully constructed his work such that everything that went on before is leading up to the teachings of Paul to establish him as a genuine teacher of the Christian gospel. But despite the efforts of the writer, we can see in the occasions that he describes that there were circumstances when Paul was indeed at loggerheads with the original disciples of Jesus. That there were occasions when he was called upon to prove himself to be true. And in order to prove himself to be true, he had to show that he was still following the Jewish law, just like the disciples of Jesus before him were doing. Now, how do we evaluate this material? How could Paul, in his writings, be saying that you do not need to follow the old Jewish law, and at the same time, now he comes in the midst of the early followers of Jesus, and he demonstrates that he is still following that law? How could you have it both ways? So there are two solutions to this. One solution is noted in the Black's commentary to the New Testament in the Acts of the Apostles, where it says that it would indicate here that Paul is acting hypocritical because he teaches one thing in his letters, and then on the other hand, he is doing something else. Well, the other solution, also noted in the same commentary, is to say that Paul was not acting hypocritically, but in fact, the Acts of the Apostles writer, the writer of this document, trying to show that Paul is in agreement with the disciples, has deliberately reworked the story such as to give the impression that Paul and the original disciples of Jesus are teaching the same thing. In other words, that this document is a piece of propaganda, and this is the term that biblical scholars have used to describe this material, especially in a place like this. And so we have now already in the first century of Christianity disputes as to what exactly did Jesus teach. But there were disputes also about who exactly he was as a person, because Paul already began elevating Jesus to a status that is far above human beings. For Paul, Jesus was God's agent in creating the world. Now, to understand this, you have to understand the Greek mindset at the time. The Greek philosophers have said that God doesn't deal directly with the world. He deals with the world through an intermediary. They said they have their own reasons for this. They said the world is always changing, God is unchanging, so how can the unchanging God deal with the changing world? They said you cannot throw a brick into the river twice, because by the time you throw the second brick, the river has moved, it has changed. It is not the same river anymore. So this was their thinking about it. They said that God doesn't deal with the world directly, he deals with the world through an agent, through an intermediary. Now, in order to create the world then, God had to create the world through his reason, through his wisdom, through his logos. Paul, in his writings, represents Jesus as that agent of God through which God created everything else. And so he was elevating Jesus higher above human beings. Jesus now becomes the creator of all human beings. Mind you, Paul is not saying that Jesus is God, because for Paul there is only one God, the God whom Jesus himself worshipped. But by speaking of Jesus in this elevated sense, he was setting the stage for a further evolution, and we will describe that shortly. So now there was a dispute as to who Jesus was, because many remembered him to be an ordinary human being. His original Jewish followers will not take him to be in any sense divine. They knew him to be a servant and the messenger of God. So here was another area of dispute. Who exactly was Jesus? Now these areas of dispute will continue for a while. There was, on the one hand, some Christian followers who continued to abide by the Jewish law. They worshiped 3 times a day in the Jewish temples. They prayed to the one true God. They continued to abide by the Jewish Sabbath and so on. They considered Jesus to be a man, a prophet, a servant, and messenger of God. On the other hand, you have followers of Paul who discarded the law. Instead of keeping the Sabbath on Saturday, they switched to Sunday. They called that the day of the Lord. But in fact, they adopted that day because that day was already a popular day in ancient Greek culture. It was the day of the sun, Sunday. It was the day when people worshiped the sun. It was already a day of holiday. And so some early Christians would adopt that and now give it a later meaning, that this is the day that Jesus rose from the dead. The Bible does not actually say that Jesus rose from the dead on the Sunday. It only says that his tomb was discovered empty on the Sunday. And it could be that he actually was already raised on the Saturday night. So there's no logical reason for picking Sunday as a specific Christian holiday, but eventually it was taken to be a holiday. The followers of Paul would discard all of the Jewish regulations in a wholesale fashion, and then eventually wonder, but do we not still have to keep the 10 Commandments? And some think you do, but one of the 10 Commandments is you have to keep the Sabbath, which they don't. So it becomes very confusing. But nevertheless, it's easy for people to think of following Paul, because you do not have to be circumcised. You can just carry on. You don't have to distinguish between kosher and non-kosher foods. You can eat anything that is sold and so on. That became then the popular religion known as Christianity. Moreover, in the Greek culture, it was easy to take a human being for God. And if anyone was important, he was either the Son of God or God himself. So Caesar, for his importance, had to be the Son of God. And if you wanted to tell people that Jesus was something special, you had to tell them that Jesus was the Son of God, at least, to make sense to them. And so this became easily the popular Christian preaching. Now, the original disciples of Jesus with their preaching could not make headway, and their preaching lasted only for a few centuries, eventually to die out before the advent of Islam. In fact, some researchers think that Islam is in a way a restatement of the early Christian belief about Jesus. And this point was in fact specifically noted in the New Jerome Biblical Commentary as it commented on Matthew chapter 5, verses number 17 to 21. Now, on the other hand, you have the followers of Paul. Now, over time, they would write their own recollection of what Jesus was about. So Gospels came to be written after the letters of Paul. Paul was writing in the decade between the years 50 to 60 of the first century of the Christian era, which would mean about 20 years after Isa alayhi salam had already left the scene. Add another 20 years, we have the Gospel according to Mark. You're welcome, Brother Sabri. Please come on up. So you have the Gospel according to Mark written around 40 years after Isa alayhi salam. Did I not say that there were 2 other Gospels written which we now know something about. One is the Gospel of Thomas that was written before Mark. The other was the Q Gospel, written also before Mark, but now we can only discover them in hindsight. Now we have the Gospels in the New Testament to deal with. We have Mark, the first one. And then we add another 15 years, we have two other Gospels, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Add another 10 years, you have the Gospel according to John. You have 4 Gospels. So roughly then, they are written around the year 70, around the year 85, and around the year 100. So 40 years after Jesus, 60 years after Jesus. Between 40 to 60 years after Jesus, you have 4 Gospels compiled. Now, in that period of time, people had to, of course, remember what Jesus said and pass that on by word of mouth for the large part. As I said, some Gospels were written, but these were mediocre Gospels, both the Gospel of Thomas and the Q Gospel. The Gospels which are compiled in the New Testament from the party of Paul, if I use that term, are the Gospels which are more extensive and give you a kind of a narrative framework. It tells you something about where Jesus was born, what he did during his life, how he eventually left the scene. They start with the birth, generally, and they end with the crucifixion. And then there is some recollection about what happened after Jesus. Some other material were written also that were compiled into the New Testament. I've spoken about Acts of the Apostles, which is like the Hayat al-Sahaba. That was written also within the first century of Christianity, towards the end of the first century, and collected in this book called the Holy Bible. So now with these documents now being written, eventually one could not be sure which written material deserves to be included in the Bible and which does not deserve inclusion. By way of cross-reference, you can note that the Quran was something that was known to the early Muslim community. People had memorized the Quran, and when it came time to write down the Quran, it was a simple matter to collect it from the written materials that were available and from the memories of those who had memorized the Quran. People had a clear understanding of where the Quran began and where it ended and what came in between. Even if some individuals were not sure about certain smaller points, but generally the community knew that this is what makes up the book called the Glorious Quran. In the case of the Christian Bible, one did not have a list of chapters and books to begin with. One had to now feel one's way around. Eventually, the Christian scholars would have to ask, which of these various documents that are floating about were written by the earliest Christian community, even by original disciples of Jesus? Let's include those. Now, by the time they were thinking about this, one could not be sure which was written by whom. There are documents which claim to be written by a certain individual, but today we know from firm evidence that that individual could not have written this document. These are called pseudonymous works, or things which are written in the name of a person, but which are falsely so named. But they're included. So Christian scholars had to use their judgment in deciding which materials to include and which ones not to include. So they used certain criteria. If the material was said to be written by a disciple, and there are good reasons for believing that a disciple of Jesus really wrote this. If the material did not contain teaching which are obviously false, meaning obviously false from their point of view, meaning that which is not contrary to what they already believe, and so on. So that sort of material were eventually compiled and made into the New Testament. Disputes arose and continued to arise about who exactly was Jesus, and these disputes had to be settled. In the Council of Nicaea in the year 325 AD, a crucial question had to be answered. Was Jesus similar to the Father, or was he of the same substance as the Father? One theologian under whom I studied, he gave an example to explain this. He said, if I take my pencil and I say, this pencil is made of wood, obviously. Now, is this pencil made of wood similar to the tree in my backyard, or is it made from the same wood as the tree in my backyard? In other words, was this broken off from the tree in my backyard and reshaped, or is it made of some other tree? So the wood is similar, but it's not from the same tree. So the Christian theologians had to answer then, is Jesus from the Father, or is he similar to the Father? The Council of Nicaea in the year 325 was presided by a certain Roman emperor, Constantine, who some 13 years before that, it is said, had a moving experience. He had a dream in which he was going to fight a battle, and he would win this battle by the cross of Christ. And so that marked a turning point for him. He actually won the battle. He understood that as having been won by the cross of Christ, and he essentially became favorable towards Christianity. It is not clear whether he actually became a Christian at that point, or whether he actually became a Christian at his deathbed. A legend says that he was baptized at his deathbed. But nevertheless, he became favorable towards Christianity. You recall that I said earlier that the earliest Christians were persecuted, but now suddenly the Christians got a favorable rap in the Roman Empire because Constantine, the Roman emperor, was favorable towards Christianity. Now Constantine wanted to bring stability to the Christian lot. People were arguing. According to Eusebius, the Christian historian writing in the 4th century, people were so divided over the issue as to who Jesus was and how he's related to the Father, that if you go to the baker to buy bread, before he sells you the bread, he will tell you something like, there was a time when the Father was not the Father, meaning that there was no Son at the time, meaning that the Son came later, and therefore he's not God, and so on. So these kinds of disputes were going on between people. Eusebius put it in an exaggerated way, saying that this threatened to rent the empire apart. Of course, what it does mean is that it was difficult to control Christian behavior. And the Emperor Constantine wanted to bring stability to all of this. He wanted to have Christians united on a single doctrine. Let them believe one thing, whatever it is, but something. So he summoned the Christian bishops together and had them mull over the issue. And a decision was reached which some regretted. A decision was reached that Jesus is very God of very God. So the pencil is not from another tree, it's from the same tree. So Jesus is very God of very God. And that meant, of course, that Jesus now can be taken as on equal terms with the Father. Now some subsequent councils had to be called in to decide other related questions. If it's decided that Jesus is on equal par with God, what about the Holy Spirit that we heard so much about? Isn't he also God? Because in the Bible, the Holy Spirit is spoken of as though this is the active force of God here in the world. God acts through his Holy Spirit in a way, so isn't that also God? So in the Council of Chalcedon, later on, it was finally finalized in the year 450 that Jesus and the Father and the Holy Spirit together make up the triune God. And that became the standard definition of their faith. Mind you, this is now 400 years after Isa alayhi salam had already left the sea. And now the kalima of Christianity finally comes to be settled and agreed upon. By contrast, you may be aware that the kalima of Islam is already in the Quran. You will find the statement La ilaha illallah in that particular form recorded twice in the Quran, and in a shorter form numerous times. La ilaha illahu, you will find it numerous times. There's no God besides him. You will find Muhammadur Rasulullah mentioned in the Quran. So the creed of Islam came to be something that was established right from what Muslims believe to be the Word of God. Whereas on the other hand, you have now continuing disputes about what exactly makes one a Christian, what exactly is Christian belief. Do we have to follow the law or do we not? Do we regard Jesus as a servant and messenger, a human person, or do we regard him as the creator of the heavens and the earth? Do we follow Paul or do we follow the original disciples of Jesus? These were the kinds of questions which had to be decided. Now, I've spoken about materials which are collected in the Bible, and I have mentioned some materials which are not collected in the Bible. The Q Gospel, for example. Now, the Q Gospel we should say something about. As far as scholars can reconstruct what is known as the Q Gospels, they are aware that the Q Gospel did not say anything about the miraculous birth of Jesus or about his dying for the sins of the world. Now this is important because it means then that it was possible to write a gospel a couple of decades after Jesus and before our present gospels without preaching in that gospel the most important doctrine of the Christian faith, that Jesus died for the sins of the world and ushered in a new age, a new manner of salvation. So that by itself is something to add to the evidence against this doctrine, the evidence showing that this is a later doctrine that was adopted by people after the original or earliest gospel was written. Now, I mentioned the gospel according to Thomas. The Gospel of Thomas is a gospel that is in some ways similar to the Gospel Q. It is a collection of some sayings of Jesus, and again it is significant that that teaching of Jesus, which Muslims would know to be the original teaching, that does not involve his death and resurrection for the sins of human beings, that also is absent. Or rather, the teaching is there present in the gospel, and the idea about his death and resurrection is not there present in the Gospel of Thomas. This would come in the later Gospels, which are preserved in the New Testament. You get some idea then of why the New Testament Gospels were preserved as they are, because those were Gospels which gelled with some of the most important doctrines of the church. Now, there were other Gospels and other documents written as well. Some of them are known as Gospels which were written in the 2nd century. Now, we don't have other materials which are very early and still surviving. We know some other material only by name. We know the Gospel of the Hebrews. We know the Egerton Gospel. Some of these have been discovered in fragmentary form, not enough for us to get a full impression of what these materials were. But much of what we have now were discovered later. In fact, in 1945, a discovery was made in Egypt at a place called Nag Hammadi. And now the discovery comes to be called generally the Nag Hammadi Scrolls. These are scrolls of some early documents that were written in the 2nd century of Christianity. Now, some of these are legendary material. Some of these give the impression that, for example, Jesus had a close relationship with one of his female disciples, a woman by the name of Mary, called Mary Magdalene, after the place from which she came. Some of these documents teach a view of the world, which I must now explain. This view of the world is known as Gnosticism. Now, Gnosticism has many varieties, but one key ingredient in many of the forms is the belief that the world somehow rests on a mistake, that the God of the Old Testament did not intend to create the world as it is. The world has in some sense been created by an evil sort of spirit, and that explains why we have so much evil in the world. And in order to be rescued from this world of evil, one had to come to some secret knowledge. One had to achieve what is called gnosis, or knowledge, and hence this term Gnostic. Gnostic Christianity is what these varieties come to be known by. Now, Gnostic Christians had their documents written, and apparently some of those documents, eventually being banned by the church, had to be concealed and eventually were buried in a stone jar, only to be discovered in 1945. Historians think that they were buried around the year 380. So here we have one set of documents. Now, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. The Dead Sea Scrolls do not relate directly to Isa alayhi salam. They're a collection of writings from the area of Qumran, near the Dead Sea, where a Jewish community that practiced celibacy and asceticism lived. They lived in caves, they kept their scriptures alive, they made copies of their documents, and these documents that were now discovered in 1947, known as the Dead Sea Scrolls, have become an important window through which we know something, much more than we knew before, about the world in which Jesus lived. Because these writings are from the period of time in which Jesus lived. And although they do not comment directly on Jesus and his life and his teachings, they tell us something about the social context, the religious background. So we can understand some of Jesus' teachings when we compare them with the teachings from the individuals who lived in that area. Now, so far what I have done is I've given you a broad historical sweep. I haven't actually spoken about the topic yet. What does all of this have to do with the Da Vinci Code? But all of this was necessary now for me to now launch directly into the topic. What is the Da Vinci Code, and how does this all relate? Now let me introduce a couple of books. First of all, here is a book called the Da Vinci Code, written by Dan Brown. It is a novel. Now, novels do not have to be taken seriously, and we shouldn't usually be having a discussion or a lecture about a novel. But this novel has proven to be very special. It is a novel that has caught the attention of theologians because it deals with theological issues. The novel basically tells us that Jesus alayhi salam was married to Mary Magdalene, one of his followers, and that he left progeny after him. A daughter was born to this lady, a daughter named Sarah, and that they traveled to France, and their progeny continued so that we have the bloodline of Jesus surviving to this day. And the book is called the Da Vinci Code because he involves Leonardo da Vinci in the ideas that he's promoting in this book. Now, because he involves names which are historical, names like Leonardo da Vinci, names like Sir Isaac Newton, and many other notable figures, he gives the book a certain air of respectability. While presenting the story in the form of a story and as a fictional representation, he sprinkles enough historical information in there so as to give the reader the firm impression that what you're reading here is not actually a fictional story, but something real, factual, that important people believe this over time, and that what this is presenting is true. It is also a cliffhanger of a piece of writing. Every chapter leaves you in some sort of suspense, so you want to turn the next page and see what happens next. It's a very moving story. So it has, in fact, been catching the public attention. Now, usually a book is introduced with a certain publishing philosophy. The law of demand and supply is related to this. It is known that if a book is published, initially, people will want to buy the book so badly that a certain segment of the population will pay, let's say, $40 to buy the book. So initially, it is published in a hardcover fashion. So one feels that he's getting his money's worth $40. But not everybody will buy the book when it's being sold for $40. Some people will wait around and think, do I really need it or not? Eventually, a couple of years later, when enough people have bought the $40 book, the publishers will bring out a soft cover version and sell it for $20. So now people who didn't want to pay $40 will now buy the soft cover version. And eventually there'll be still some people who do not want to pay $20. They'll wait till it goes on a publisher's clearance. So you'll go where there's the big barn with 80% off discount, and then you go buy it there for half price. You'll pay $10. So publishers do have their philosophy. Now, Dan Brown's book, The Da Vinci Code, has been selling so well that in fact they haven't gone to soft cover. They have gone to hardcover. They have gone to an illustrated edition which sells for much more money. And now they have just spiced it up with some illustrations, and they've made this a very lucrative Christmas gift. In fact, if you buy it at Chapters now, they sell it to you in a free gift box so that you can give it to somebody as a gift. So they're going upwards. Plus, a movie is being produced now based on this book. So it is something that is catching the public attention. If you go now into Chapters, you will find that a whole table is dedicated just to books relating to this. There are these books, plus books written about the book. Secrets of the Code by Dan Bernstein. The Da Vinci Code Decoded by Martin Lund. The Gospel Code by Ben Wetherington. And the Truth and Fiction in the Da Vinci Code by Bart Ehrman. And these are only some of the books. So you can see books are being written about the book. It has become then a very important book. Now, why is it catching the public attention like this? A few points. In the fictional telling here of the story, the author is promoting a few ideas which are becoming now popular ideas. And we should understand this. As a person involved in dawah, I'm very interested in what makes the public tick. I want to know what ideas are attractive to people. I want to know what they're thinking. So we know how to present the message to them. If you understand what means something to them, you can show them how Islam is meaningful to them. We can also understand something about the challenges that we face as Muslims living in the midst of a modern popular culture. You have to know what are some of the ideas that your children, for example, will be privy to. What are some of the ideas that could confuse their minds? You have to be able to explain these things to them. So someone comes and says, well, it looks like Jesus was married and he left progeny. Now that may not mean much to Muslims, because if he was married and if he had progeny, he would just be like so many other prophets who married and had progeny. That would not affect anything crucial that Muslims believe in. Of course, it will affect what Christians believe in, because if Jesus is the Son of God and he has a daughter, then that will be the granddaughter of God. And you can see that there are difficulties here that makes people pay attention to this book. But we have to be aware of some of the other ideas. For example, this book promotes the idea that goddess worship is a good thing. In fact, the book ends when the primary character in the book eventually finds himself bowing down. He falls to his knees just before a pyramid under which he believes Mary Magdalene to be buried. And he even thinks he hears Mary Magdalene's voice coming up from within the tomb. So when one gets to that point, if one is hooked by the book, one is also hooked to the idea that worshipping the goddesses of old is a good thing. In fact, he promotes this idea. And the idea becomes popular. It's one of the reasons why his book is selling. Many people have become dissatisfied with what they call patriarchal religion. And they classify Judaism, Christianity, and Islam all together as being representative of this. They see that in these religions, women are generally subjugated. They have very little say, whether it be in the church, in the synagogue, in the mosque, in the leadership. They see that sometimes the women are denied their rights, and they want to react to that by going to the other extreme. Now, this problem was especially noteworthy in Christianity, because in Christianity you have God being the father but not mother. God has a son but not a daughter. And the priest had to be a male priest because he was representing Christ, who was a male, and so on. So the problem was compounded. People had to pray to God as the Father, as opposed to just simply praying to God as Muslims do. And so women had severe obstacles to deal with. Plus, when we look at the way in which women are represented in the Bible, sometimes there are passages that really makes your eyebrow raise. And you wonder, is this really what was originally intended, or did people later on write it in like this? So because of the manner in which women were represented, particularly in Christianity, now the popular culture wants to let the pendulum swing the other way and celebrate femininity, glorify women, talk about the greatness of women. And one of the things they're thinking about is that it looks like what has happened in the Judeo-Christian tradition is that God has become decidedly male. So let's look for the feminine. Let God be a woman for a change. So now they go back to ancient forms of worship. They find artifacts. And of course, ancient people worship anything that seemed to be directly related to physical life. So they looked at the sun. The sun helps life, so worship the sun. Water is essential to life, so worship the rivers. Women give birth, so worship women. Worship especially the women in the pregnant form. So you might find many ancient artifacts of goddesses, especially pregnant women depicted as goddesses. People worship the cow because the cow became very important for people. You utilize every part of the cow. You drink the milk and the child can survive on a cow's milk just like the child can survive on the mother's milk. So worship the cow. People worshipped anything that was directly related to life. In ancient times, people worshipped goddesses. And now this book is promoting forms of religion that worship goddesses. And so that is all worked into the story. So even though it is a fictional representation, you find the main characters in the story whom you're supposed to respect, again and again emphasizing that worshiping the sacred feminine is very important. And now, another part of it is that people have become dissatisfied with the Catholic Church. Now, this book is a severe criticism of the Catholic Church. People have become dissatisfied on a number of points. Many people, for example, lately have become quite disheartened with the Catholic Church after we heard stories breaking out from one quarter after another showing that the altar boys were sexually molested by their priests. And so sometimes there were attempts made to cover up this sort of happening. So now this is highlighted in the book. Here is the church. This is what the church has been doing. How can you respect a church that does that? Now, starting with some things which are known, now the book goes to things which are to be proved and just simply assumes the things which are to be proved. You see, there's a certain psychology. If a writer tells you, look, you see this thing and you know that to be true, but look what else is true. By the time you agree with him on what you know to be true, he slips in something else which you didn't know to be true, but which you will nevertheless accept because he's already won your confidence. And so because of the problems which are known with the Catholic Church, what the authors try to say now, see, just as the Catholic Church has been covering up certain things, such as the abuse of the altar boys, they have also been covering up the fact that the earliest form of Christianity involved the worship of the feminine. And that is what we need now to restore as the original and true Christianity. Now, that, of course, is historically incorrect. That has not been the original and true form of Christianity. Some of this can be noted in the Gnostic Gospels. But as I've already pointed out, the Gnostic Gospels are not the earliest of the Gospels to be written. These are writings that came in the Nag Hammadi Scrolls, discovered in 1945, but they date from the 2nd century of Christianity. They are not from the original disciples of Jesus. Now, the story goes on to try and emphasize that there are secret societies that kept alive the knowledge of Jesus. And conspiracy theories and secret societies, these are the stuff of legend, and these are the things that fuel human curiosity. Everybody wants to know something about the Knights Templars, about the Freemasons, about the Priory of Sion, as he speaks about here, and about secret societies who have kept some secret knowledge. But as it turns out, there is no secret knowledge to be revealed. In fact, the whole story takes the form of the characters looking for the secret knowledge, the Davinci Code, to solve it, to reveal that secret knowledge to the world. And eventually, as they come to the end of the story, there is nothing to be shown. It's almost like the Ark of Noah. If you read any book that says that they have discovered the Ark of Noah, they will tell you about somebody who had the photographs, and that person, by the time we got to him, the person had died, and the photographs could not be found, but we knew that he had the photograph because somebody said they saw him with the photograph, and so on. So you always go to dead-end links that do not actually arrive at anything concrete. When you thought you were solving one clue after another to eventually come to the final place where it is said that the remains of Mary Magdalene are buried, together with documents which will verify the fact that Mary Magdalene's descendants are the true inheritors of the teachings of Jesus and not the Catholic Church. Eventually we arrive at a church in Glasgow, and it is discovered that it's not here, but then it is somewhere else. And why the somewhere else? Without any valid proof or any solid evidence, the main character just simply satisfies himself that that is the place. He finally goes to the pyramid and he falls on his knees and he's worshipping Mary Magdalene. So now, in sum, we have here a fictional representation, a story about Jesus, taking the form as though it is fact. And it is presented in such a way that it is gripping the readership. It's creating a phenomenon so that books have to be written about this book, and eventually there's going to be a movie about it. It is essential that we know something about this book. We know something about its fictional representation. We understand that what it presents as history, where it mingles in some history in the story, much of that itself is not actually historical. Some of it is true, some of it is not. What it needs to support its main point, or its main points, are not true. It is not true to say that Isa alayhi salam was married to Mary Magdalene. And although it does not affect the faith of Muslims to believe that he was married, there is no evidence to show that he was married. There are some clues that a certain woman was close to him in the New Testament, but that is not sufficient to show that he was married. In fact, not even the Nag Hammadi Scrolls that were discovered show that Mary was married to Jesus. There is some indication again, but nothing conclusive. And so to say that Mary was married to Jesus, that they had children, and that this was covered up for centuries, this is really to ask us to believe too much. It's too much to ask us to believe, and we should not believe such things without any clear evidence. To say that goddess worship was the earliest form of Christianity is also a blatant lie. There is no such evidence that any such thing transpired. As far as we know, Christianity began as a Jewish sect, and the main difference between this Jewish sect and the others was that this Jewish sect felt that the Messiah has come, and that is Jesus. They continue to worship like other Jews. They prayed in the same synagogue. They worship the same God. That is the God of the Old Testament, the one who is called Yahweh in the Hebrew, and is called Elohim in the Hebrew, or Elo for short, and is called Allah in the English translations of the Bible. The one true God who says, "Before me no God was formed, nor shall there be after me. I am God, and besides me there is no other." That is the only God that is worshipped. In the New Testament, the documents collected about Isa alayhi salam in the Bible, we find the same thing, that the earliest Christians are worshiping only one God. That is the God of their ancestors, the God of Abraham and Jacob and of Moses. That again is not a male or a female God. It's just simply God who created all males and females. There is no record that the earliest Christians in fact worshipped a goddess. And to pretend that one is now recovering the earliest form of Christianity, which the Catholic Church here sought to put on the ground, is really to put forward here a blatant lie. The book does have some points of merit, especially from the point of view of Islam. One perhaps might be encouraged to find that there are certain points at which, and I will close with this very quickly, the book does admit some of the failings of the Catholic Church, some of the ways in which they have departed indeed from the teachings of Jesus, some of the ways in which the gospel material was written very late and collected into the New Testament at a very late date. I know that some questions will arise from this, and I'll be glad to answer your question, inshallah, after the prayer and after we have a chance to hear from our beloved brother, Abdullah Sabri. But I'll pass the mic for the moment back to the MC, and he will encourage us to stay for the evening and inform us about where we go from here.